Hello and welcome to episode 8 of How Are You? I'm Marty, Smiley, your host for Pedestrian's newest podcast and video series, talking all things youth mental health, sponsored by Kids Helpline. On today's episode, the final episode, we're talking about toxic relationships. We've all witnessed and sometimes even laughed at behaviours we've seen in reality TV, the blow-ups, the betrayal, the manipulation and mistrust. But sometimes life can be just as dramatic. And when it is, when someone really close to you is being toxic, it can be really hard to speak up about. But today, that's what we're going to do. As always, we stopped some pedestrians to ask, how would you describe toxic behaviour?
I suppose toxic behaviour to me is conforming to what we believe we should be, and not really being true to ourselves and not really analysing our actions and what they mean and how we're feeling and what those feelings mean as well.
Repetitively putting someone down and purposefully, especially even maybe accidentally doing it and then knowing that it was hurtful and then still doing it is like sort of toxic behaviour.
Toxic behaviour, bullying and stuff like that.
When they're not encouraging and they're not supporting you in your lifestyle choices or like to better improve yourself. So I think if they're kind of helping you stay stagnant or they're encouraging you to make bad life choices, I think that's a toxic relationship, and that can, those can be people that you still consider your friends. It doesn't necessarily have to be bad people, but I think it's just people that aren't really helping you grow as a person.
When you lose sight of who you are as a person and that person changes you, the person you're with, to something that you're not. And I've actually experienced that in my last relationship. Who I was becoming, uncharacteristic. I showed behaviour that wasn't me. At the end of the day, I said to myself, this just isn't for me. And I think that is toxic. That's my definition of a toxic relationship. Yeah.
I think I'm very fortunate to have a group of friends that I love completely and that we don't really have any problems with. I don't think I've really been ever backstabbed by a close girlfriend. Definitely witnessed it in other friendship groups, but I'd say I'm fortunate enough to have incredible friends. Yeah, for sure. I think we're not really educated on relationships enough from a young age, especially as women. So when you grow up and enter relationships, you're kind of blindly going through and kind of had to figure it out for yourself and kind of take those opportunities to learn from it, I guess.
I think, I'd probably start with confronting them and just tell them what they've done and how it's made me feel, and maybe give them examples of what I'd expect in the future. You're doing this, instead of doing that, why don't you do it this sort of way, yeah.
Now it is time for the check-in, and this week we're talking to Concetta Caristo. She's a comedian and improv actress, and she gets on stage every night and spills the bean on her life. And although people laugh, a lot of the time what she's talking about comes from a deep place of hurt. When it comes to toxic relationships, she's definitely got a doctorate in understanding them. Welcome to the show, Concetta.
Thank you so much. Wow, what a bio.
Yeah.
A lot of hurt. Let's talk about it.
What was the toxicity level of, I guess, the relationship that you first saw modeled to you, your parents' relationship?
Yeah, huge. So, toxicity level was quite high.
Radioactive?
Yeah, quite intense. So the tea is I grew up, and I had an abusive father. So really violent. And, when you're a kid, that's just you're like, okay, cool, this is just my dad. You know what I mean? You know that it's awful and hard, and there's also really happy moments, but you're also just you're not just seeing the abuse, you're just being well, this is just my dad, and I guess this is just my life. And it was really hard because to understand as a kid that the person who loves you and is supposed to look after you can also hurt you is just really
confusing.
It's really confusing, yeah.
Well, when you were growing up, could you tell us a little bit about your family, what your home was like?
Okay, so I'm Italian. That's where we start. Okay, I'm Italian, a proud Italian woman. And there was my father, my mom, and my little sister, and me.
When was the first time you realised maybe your parents' relationship wasn't super healthy?
I mean, maybe just in like more teenage years. I think I grew to be really like resentful and upset of what was happening. Like it was just really unhappy sometimes at home, and it just sort of meant that like I grew up always being on and trying to make sure that everything was good all the time. Do you know what I mean? Because like if things were good and dad was happy, that meant the whole house is happy. So it just meant each of us were hyper vigilant, working around one person. Like that's a really insane way to live. It's like my life felt like it revolved around one person, and that's just really draining, I guess. And so I think just growing up with that, I think it really hit me in year 12. Like I was really burnt out in year 12, and I was just like, I was just depressed and sad, and there's nothing I can do about it. And that's what it felt like. And
did you have conversations with your mum about it? I suppose when you think about supporting someone who is experiencing a relationship that is toxic, you know, how do you talk to them and support them, especially when they're your mum?
The hard thing is, like, I think it was like a hard thing to talk about. I just feel like we would support each other and just being like, we're getting through this together. Do you know what I mean? Like, of just being like, I love you and I care about you, and it's just felt like you just get up the next day and you live the next day. There was just this thing of like, it was just about survival, I guess, in the end.
What made you stuck in that situation? Was there an opportunity to leave? Could you have removed yourself? Could your mother have removed herself from that situation?
Yeah, I mean, people talk about that all the time, about like, why didn't you just go? Why didn't you just leave? But you don't realize that like this stuff is all, as much as there's violence, there's so much emotional stuff attached. Like the stakes are so high sometimes, and like it annoys me sometimes when people want to simplify it and just be like, you can just whatever, and it's like, no, there's so more nuanced than that. Like my mom is like a strong, intelligent woman, and like just dealing with this, and also emotionally, like she's probably someone who's like vulnerable and sensitive, and also is thinking about her career. They had a joint like business, that we have a family. Like there's just so much that means that it's so hard. And even me, I was just like, I just had never could fathom that like, oh, I'm gonna get out of this. I was like, this is my father, this is what I've been dealt. I guess I would think about like growing up, and when I would get married, I'd be like, oh, the man I marry will have to be some like Italian man that my father likes, and that'll be that. Like I just sort of like, that's just how I was. But my sister, I think, was a lot more different, and was kind of the catalyst in what got us to go. And she saw a way out. And then that sort of like, once I saw that was possible, and my mum too, that's when it kicked us into gear, and we were like, okay, maybe we can get out of this.
Did it come to a breaking point?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I was saying about my sister, she was really like not doing well at school, and there was one day where she, I think, had gone to school, but she'd like packed an extra bag or like a backpack or something, and she like called my mum crying from the bathrooms at school, and she was like, I can't do this anymore. I was going to run away. Like, I can't, this is, and so, my mom, was like, okay, that's it. Like, it just snapped in her, and she was like, okay, I'm going to, you know, my kids are, so, like, I love my kids. I'm going to put them first. And from then, that sort of, like, got things in the works. And I remember we were, like, driving to school one day, and my mom was driving, and my sister was in the front, and I was in the back, because mom would drive us to school every day, and they turned around, they were like, hey, so how do you feel about if we were to run away? Like, I don't know if that's verbatim, but that was the vibe. And I was like, is this real? What, you mean for real? We can just go? And they were like, yeah. And mum sort of like talked about like because there's a lot of now admin involved in trying to do that.
Yes.
But you have to understand there was no light bulb before that of me being
Wow.
like, I could just, even like going to the police, like I was like, nope, there's no way that I'll be safe. Like he'll just come and get like, I'd already like had blocks in my head being like, nope, there's no one higher than my dad. I just have to make sure but that's my personal, that's how I saw that.
That's a really courageous impulse by your sister to just come to a point where she could admit to herself, I'm fed up, I'm done.
Absolutely.
And it helped your mum be able to kick into gear.
Yeah.
And then you, so what happened?
So then over the next few months, we like plotted, like, because that's the thing, we didn't think it would just be like, bye dad, see you later, you're a bad man, okay, bye. Like, no, we were like, okay, this needs to be like some 007 stuff, okay, you know what I mean, like fingerprints and like special secret whatever. So you
all dressed up in disguises.
that's right.
Yeah.
But it took like over a couple of months. My mum got in touch with like the domestic violence hotline, and that is where I like owe so much, like everything to, for being right here, is the people that helped my mum talk her through, because they knew it was like this was like high intensity domestic violence. There was like so much control going on and everything, so that they like met up with my mum secretly for like coffee and sort of like, you know, gave her like support, assistance, information, guidance of like how we can do this where you and your kids will be safe. And over the next 2 months it took me like taking clothes secretly out and like pack, like, do you know what I mean? It was like a very incremental thing. And then one day after it was all sort of like, we were like, this is the day we go, which by the way, it was Halloween. Okay, wow, is that not special?
Spooky.
Spooky, absolutely. We got up just like a normal day going to school, and then we packed everything and we drove to a women's shelter, and that's where we stayed for the next like couple of months while we were getting ready to then move. We moved into state, so it's like some covert stuff. It was very very intense, but it just felt like this was the only way we were gonna get out. That's how fearful we were. And you know what I mean? That's like, okay, this is the option we're taking.
Wow. How do you recover from an experience like that?
Good question. I mean, being out of it and then being in a whole new different place, where we sort of knew no one, was like the first step of just like being outside of it. And
how did that feel?
It felt a real mixture of things. Like, it felt really freeing. It also felt a bit lonely, because I sort of literally gave up my entire life. There was like no goodbyes.
Of course,
it was just like, it was so dramatic, I guess. But and it was just like hopeful. It was like, I was curious, I was like grateful. It was like, you know, so many different things all at once. I think that year away, because we thought we'd be there forever, but then it didn't really pan out to be like that. And we came back in Sydney, obviously. But that really, I'm grateful for the time where it felt like we could just be the three of us, because my whole life it had always been the four of us, like us and my dad. And so that gave us a lot of moments that were really, I don't know, really like special. And it was just, I guess, I learned a lot about myself. We learned a lot about each other. And it's still happening now. Like, it's still ongoing, like learning about each other and figuring out our relationships to each other.
How does that kind of experience influence the kind of relationships you start to build in new friendship groups, in new places, and with new romantic relationships?
Yeah. Big way, actually. And here's the beautiful part. Like, after that happened, honestly, in my head, I thought, wow, now I'm out of that. Now I don't have like this father who's like controlling me and beating me or whatever. I'm like, my life should be good now. Like, I have no excuse. I can do whatever I want. Everything should fall into place, right? Like, I'm just another normal person now. And I learned that it is absolutely not like that, and that what you go through as a child growing up, whatever your parents, shapes you entirely. And that kind of like revealed itself to me from a romantic relationship that I had, a really, really good one, surprisingly. Like, I remember, like, this sounds weird, but, like, my dad would, like, you know how there'd be ads on TV of, like, domestic violence being, like, and it'd be, like, I don't even remember the ads, but it would just, like, have that. And my dad would be, like, you know, you better not go with someone who hurts you like that. And I would sit there being, like, you absolute hypocrite. I hate you. How dare you? And so, like, I grew up knowing that, like, that's probably not a good thing if you get into a relationship with someone that is violent towards you. But the thing is, like, abusive, toxic relationships it's not always just violence. It can be in smaller ways, different ways, subtle ways. And that's something that I, like, got to learn about. But I had a boyfriend who was one of the most like loving, kind, open, beautiful souls who, like, opened me up, and we would get into these, like, patterns. There'd be patterns where, like, I would be, like, reacting really big to lots of small things, and it became really, really draining. And I remember he would say to me, like, I think, you know, when I would, like, open up to him, he'd be like, I think, you know, I love you and I care about you, but maybe you need to talk to someone about, like, these feelings that you're having. And I remember immediately being like, okay, if you don't love me the way I am, like, how dare you? I'm going to put you in the bin, like, blah, blah, blah. But then eventually I, like, got to thinking, I'm like, maybe there is some stuff that I love you. I want to love you. And there's something that's blocking me. And so that got me into sitting in a chair and eventually, like, talking to a counsellor. And I'm going to tell you right now, Mr. Marty Smiley, that blew my whole world open, because I sat in that chair and she was like, okay, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, my father came up, and I realized that, like, the work starts, like, now. Like, there is so much that I've, like, learned about love and about hurt and about, like, protecting myself and stuff that came from my upbringing, that was meaning that, like, having relationships was really hard. And there was a reason for that, which was really good, which meant for the next couple of months I was just getting to, like, work on myself, and that helped our relationship be better. And it's taught me so much.
I think often sometimes when we think about, like, when we even bring toxic into the conversation, a lot of people might be like, I'm not that kind of person. Like, that's not me. But they might be surprised by what toxic behaviors are.
Totally. It's behavior. It doesn't mean, like, you're a bad person. We're all just, like, learning and like that's what I mean. It's what we've learned. That's how we act. And it's not until we acknowledge that about each other, make boundaries, call it out or whatever, that you're able to, like, navigate what's going on. It's behaviors.
What would you say are some of the boundaries that you've placed in your life to avoid having an unhealthy relationship?
Ask for what you need, and it's a compromise, and it's a discussion. And here's the interesting part. You learn a lot about the person that you're doing this with, of how they respond about you having boundaries. If they are, like, understanding, they listen, they're, like, accepting, that's great. That's what you want. But if they're, like, rude, if they, like, shut you down, if they make you feel crap, if they don't listen and don't accept them, that's a red flag for sure.
Sexual boundaries is a big one as well.
Totally.
Gender equality.
Yeah.
As a boundary within relationships.
It's like talking about it. It's just talking about what you each need. I grew up with, like, movies, whatever, loved it. And in my head, I thought that love was like in the movies, where it's like, if this person wants you, they're gonna, like, do everything they can. They're gonna, like, show up at your house, and they're gonna, and even when you're fighting and you're, like, and they're, like, knocking on your window, and they're,
you
like,
thought you'd get a knock at the door, the guy with, like, placards, and just, like, one by one letting him know that he's loved you for an entirety of
that's
time.
right, absolutely.
Love Actually
Absolutely.
is actually a deeply messed up movie.
But that's right, and I didn't.
I'm gonna film her at a wedding secretly on my camcorder.
Yeah, that's love, to be a stalker. What about that song by Sting where it's like, every breath you take? That's about stalking.
Okay,
and everyone's like, everyone's playing it at their
Didn't know
weddings.
that.
Yeah, it is. Look it up. Yeah. Oh, it's not.
But
Sting,
yeah, do you
it's-
think,
the
like,
police.
some of those things aren't very helpful?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like, we kind of, I mean, that's what you're seeing reflected all the time. It's why we're trying to, like, destabilize the narrative of like rom-coms and like it's like this way and this is because that's what you see all the time.
The fantasy narrative.
Yeah,
and
honestly, it wasn't until being with that boyfriend where I was like, when I would do the thing where I wouldn't want to talk about something, and I'd be like, I'm not, and I would just like go offline, and I would like go home and like not talk to him, and I'd be like, why didn't you chase me? Why didn't you call me lots of times? Why didn't you show up at my house? Why didn't you surprise me here? And he was like, dude, because that's not. I don't have your consent. That's not helpful. Like, you've said that you
This
want
isn't
space.
a movie.
You're making it clear that you want to be away from me. So why would I go chase you? And when I heard that, I was like, what? What are you talking about? And then I was like, whoa. Okay, wow.
Gary would turn up at my door.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Gary's a psycho.
Yeah,
Don't be with Gary. I was with the right guy. So totally.
Gary.
Don't be Gary. It's like unlearning that stuff for sure is huge. And I didn't even see that. Like, and that's something that I'm learning.
Thank you
Very
for
beautiful.
sharing your story with me.
Thank you.
It can be really hard to talk about relationships that are like that.
Yeah.
And the fact that you've come this far to be here talking about it, you
Yeah.
know, for however long we have been talking about it,
Yeah.
I think is super remarkable, and you should be really proud of yourself.
Thank you. I love you.
Now it is time for On the Line with our Kids Helpline expert, Josie. She's taking a break from the phones to join us today.
Good to be here.
You know, this conversation around being able to notice when you're in a relationship that's really not serving you might be hard to identify. Can you see the kind of telltale signs when you're on the phone with someone that, you're probably in a relationship that's not serving you?
It can be a really tricky thing to pick up, right? Because it's really hard, you know, for us as a counsellor to have a think about someone else's relationships and the impacts that those relationships might be having on them. So we really rely on the people calling us to tell us what's happening. And, you know, sometimes we can pick up on things or point things out, but really what's most important is, what is that person experiencing? What doesn't feel right to them? What does feel right to them? And what's their preference for moving forward in that relationship?
There might be times when maybe people call you on a crisis point when they're, I don't know whether they're in danger. I'm sure you refer them to the right service if that happens. But, you know, do you get calls sometimes when people are really fearing for either their safety or the future of their relationship?
100%. Yeah. And I think because we're a service that's around 24 hours a day, we get contacts, you know, when people are facing, you know, those dark times or feeling out of control or have reached a point at which they're not quite sure who else to turn to. And so we can have some really heavy conversations with people at some really dark times. And we're grateful for that opportunity. That is what we're there for. And we're happy that, you know, even when people are really struggling, feeling really low and are up against some really difficult interactions with other people, that they take the time and look after themselves by giving us a call.
What, in your experience, what kind of damage can you hear it doing to their self-esteem, their self-worth?
Yeah, I think, you know, the word toxic relationship is really interesting in this space, and it can feel like if you're in a relationship, a friendship, a family connection with someone who you've identified, you know, may not have your best interests at heart or maybe doing some things that are quite damaging, it can be really easy to feel like you're out of control, and to feel like you're not in control of that relationship and how you hold yourself within that relationship. And I think part of our work there is to figure out, okay, we can't control what other people do. And feeling manipulated is pretty awful. And unfortunately, we don't have a huge amount of say into how the people in our lives will always treat us. But what we do have control over is how we react to that, how we take care of ourselves, and how, if we reach a breaking point or if we notice that someone is crossing a line, that we identify that line. And I think that's a really important part of taking care of yourself and making sure that perhaps you won't reach this point again, or that maybe that person has a warning that this is the line.
Is it a gendered issue in some ways? Like, I know we hear a lot about toxic masculinity, sometimes to the point where people don't want to talk about it because it's over talked about sometimes in the media, but the message still rings through.
Yeah, I think this idea of expectations that young men have on them is can be really difficult to figure out. And, you know, there's one thing to be in a one-on-one friendship or relationship that feels toxic in some way or feels damaging in some way. But it's a whole other thing to think about, perhaps I'm part of a society that is inherently toxic or a social group that's inherently toxic. And that can feel like something in which you don't have a huge amount of control. And it can feel very scary if you're wanting to confront that or change a part of that.
We've heard from Concetta's story that from an early age, the way we see our parents' relationship can often inform how we are in relationships. Do you hear that come up a lot?
Definitely. In positive and negative.
Yeah,
you know,
true.
sometimes it means people are striving for a relationship like the ones that have been modeled to them, and maybe what they're coming up against isn't matching that high expectation. We don't know what to base our expectations off of until we have our own experiences to sort of challenge, you know, what we've seen modeled to us. And it can be really confronting when we notice that our expectations aren't quite lining up, or even to notice that what we've seen and what we've learnt from other relationships is not actually the healthy option or the one that's going to serve us the best.
Well, once again, for the last time, thank you so much
Over.
for joining us, Josie. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you want to find out more about it, you can head to kidshelpline.com.au or contact them anytime or for any reason on 1800 55 1800. You can also hit them up on web chat. Hey, we have reached the end of the entire podcast series, but good news is, if you really like the way that we did this, you can actually check out the rest of the Pedestrian Podcast Network. There's plenty of other podcasts to listen to, or you can subscribe to our channels on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify, and where all other good podcasts are heard. That's it. Thanks so much for coming along on this journey into mental health. I'll see you later. If you do want to hear about all the other podcasts that Pedestrian is doing, they have the Pedestrian Podcast Network. You can get it. You got to subscribe to it on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify, or where all other podcasts, all the good ones, are found.